In the first part of this video, you have seen how the PAP has forced Singaporeans to give them our CPF so that they can use our CPF to earn money for themselves. However, Singaporeans are left with one of the least adequate retirement funds in the world. In this part of the video, we will show you how the PAP uses your CPF, HDB and debt to entrap Singaporeans. So let's get back to 1994. In 1994, the wage share in Singapore dropped to a low of 40%. In 1994, the PAP forced Singaporeans to contribute a high proportion of our wages into CPF. And in 1994, the PAP gives us the lowest CPF interest rate on our CPF. In 1994, the PAP started cutting down on Singaporeans. Now, so because of the low wages that we receive and the high proportion of our wages that we have to sacrifice to the CPF, more than 2/3 of Singaporeans simply do not have enough to spend on anything else other than basic necessities. More than 2/3 of Singaporeans cannot afford major purchases such as a car, appliances, furniture, or home repair. Now, these are basic things that you need at home and we cannot afford it because the PAP pays us the lowest wages among the developed countries and they suck up the biggest chunk of our wages into their CPF. What this means is that the PAP has calculated very carefully how much they need to give us in wages so that they can then take back in CPF and make us pay just enough for what we need. The 42% wage share that the PAP has given to us is not accidental. They have calculated it so carefully so that they know how much they need to give us and take it back. And no wonder why the PAP wants Singaporeans to think that the wage share in Singapore has always remained at 40% since 1980s, because they do not want us to know that at one point in time, Singaporeans were actually receiving higher wages and we were much better off than we were today. So why does the PAP want to hide the fact that Singaporeans used to be better off and our lives are much harder and harsher now? Now let me give you some context. As I had written before, the PAP monopolizes essential services in Singapore like housing, public transport, education, healthcare, telecommunications, public utilities and estate management. And because the PAP owns all the essential services in Singapore, they're so brazen about increasing the transport fares as and when they want to. They're so brazen about increasing the subscription to the World Cup because they get to. Who's gonna stop them? So see if you get this. The PAP has already calculated how much they need to give us in wages and that is why they are only willing to give us a 42% wage share of our wages. And out of the wage that the PAP is willing to give us, the PAP takes back 37% and put it back into their CPF for their investments. And for the rest of your wage, remember Singaporeans only have enough to pay for what they need. So essentially Singaporeans only have enough to pay for essential services. And because the PAP has monopolized all the essential services, what this means is that for the rest of our wages, it goes back to the PAP. So the PAP has calculated how much they need to give you in terms of your wages and take it back 100%. Now so much so that personal consumption as a proportion of GDP in Singapore has fallen all the way since 1977 to the lowest ever at 35% today. And so as I had estimated, 28% of Singaporeans are living in poverty today. And for the bottom 30%, they are forced to spend 105% to 151% of their income on essential services. Now what this means is that the poorest 30% in Singapore are not even paid enough to have a basic standard of living in Singapore. Now what this means is that for the poorest 30% in Singapore, the PAP has already calculated how much they are willing to give to the poorest 30% so that they can not only take back 100% from them but also force them to go into a debt of 5% to 51%. Now what this means is that the PAP intentionally cuts down on the wages of the poorest 30% so that they do not have enough and they have to beg the PAP for more. The PAP has thus created a 30% disempowered class that will have to permanently beg from the PAP. Now so there's a debt of 5% to 51%. And who pays for this debt? According to Mr. Leong Tze-Hien, Singaporeans have contributed $10.8 billion into the Medisave, and we have to pay tax as well. So the PAP takes from Singaporeans for healthcare, our Medisave, and tax. And let's look at how much the PAP is willing to return back to Singaporeans. What the PAP gives back in terms of healthcare subsidies Medisave withdrawals and Medishield payouts only amounts to 9.76 billion, or less than what we contribute in terms of Medisave. Now, so if we are already paying more than what is needed in the Medisave, then why are we paying tax for? By last year, the Medisave has accumulated $66 billion, and if you look at how much the PAP has spent on healthcare, PAP only spends $4 billion, and this is only 6% of the total Medisave balance. Now what this means is that Singaporeans have been forced to pay too much into the Medisave, and the PAP is giving back too little to Singaporeans. Now why do we need to pay so much to Medisave, and why do we need to double pay by paying taxes as well? And if you look at transport, what Singaporeans pay in terms of fare revenue is actually more than what is necessary for the transport operators to run. This means that Singaporeans are paying 13% more than what is necessary to run our public transportation in Singapore. Now if that's the case, why are we paying tax? And if you look at education, Mr. Leong See Hien has highlighted that NUS and NTU has a surplus of more than 450 million last year. Now this surplus will be able to give all Singaporeans free education in the universities. Yet, the PAP is more willing to give this money to foreign students for their scholarships. So much so that more than 50% of foreign students are on scholarships, but only 6% of Singaporeans are on scholarships. In fact, Singaporeans now pay the most expensive university tuition fees in the world because the PAP is more willing to accumulate surpluses for themselves, more willing to give foreign students scholarships instead of Singaporeans. Then why are we even paying tax to the PAP? When what we pay in tuition fees is more than enough to cover for the operating expenses for the universities. And if you look at how much the PAP is willing to spend on social assistance for Singaporeans, the PAP is only willing to spend 2% of GDP for Singaporeans. Now compare this to the other countries. Japan is willing to pay 15%, Taiwan is willing to pay 13%, even Hong Kong is willing to pay twice as much as the PAP is willing to. So what is wrong with the PAP? Now, and because the PAP is unwilling to spend on Singaporeans, low-income Singaporeans are forced to go into a debt of 5% to 51%. And now that you can see how the PAP is making us double pay on essential services for healthcare, for education, for transport, and for other essential services, you will know that the PAP is actually making Singaporeans pay for the debts of other Singaporeans instead of the PAP taking responsibility for it. Now remember, the PAP is the one who has cut down on poor Singaporeans. It is the PAP who is unwilling to implement a minimum wage. It is the PAP who has refused to give higher wages to the low-income workers in Singapore. Yet the PAP has the cheek to give the least back for social assistance for Singaporeans. So what does this all mean? The PAP pays nothing. So now that you have seen that the PAP monopolizes all essential services in Singapore, it is no wonder that Singapore has been ranked the 5th easiest country in the world where politically connected businessmen are most likely to prosper. This means that if you are not related to the PAP, life is going to be really bad for you. And so, since the PAP controls all the essential services, they can make Singaporeans double pay on everything that they own. So welcome to the first trick in the PAP's book, the double paying trickery. To make you pay double on all essential services so that you can pay for the debts of other Singaporeans and so that they can also make profits off you. Next, let's look at CPF again. As I have mentioned, the PAP has forced Singaporeans to pay the highest CPF contribution rate in the world. The PAP gives Singaporeans the lowest interest rates since 1963 and in the world. Then the PAP calculates how much Singaporeans would have accumulated in the CPF, and they then calculate how much they need to increase the HDB flats so that they can extract out your CPF. Then they force you to pay a high 2.6% interest rate on your HDB mortgage, and then they make you pay an additional accrued 2.5% interest to lend you what is supposedly your money in the first place. And with what is left in your CPF, the PAP puts in a CPF minimum sum to trap the rest of your money in the CPF. So this is how the PAP tricks Singaporeans using the CPF and the HDB. Now so much so that nearly 90% of Singaporeans are not able to meet the CPF minimum sum, and that is why we cannot save and we cannot retire. So in 1994, the PAP forced the wage share of Singaporeans to drop to 40% and cut down on Singaporeans' wages. In 1994, the PAP increased the contribution rates of Singaporeans to a high of 40% and further cut down on the wages of Singaporeans. In 1994, the PAP pushed the CPF interest rates to a low of 2.5% and cut down on Singaporeans' CPF. And in 1994, the PAP allowed the CPF to be used to purchase HDB resale flats, which forced Singaporeans to pay more out of our CPF for the mortgage and the accrued interest and further cut down on Singaporeans' CPF. So there you have it, the second trick in the PAP's book, the wage, CPF, HDB trinity. Pay your low wage, force you to sacrifice a large chunk of the wage into the CPF, pay you a low interest on the CPF, and force you to pay your CPF into the HDB. So what's the net result? Of the annual income that Singaporeans have, we have to borrow 151% of our income just so that we can spend. And Singapore's household debt as a proportion of GDP has increased from 45% in 2005 to 55% in 2010 and 75% last year. According to Moody's, household debt has grown to 77.2% of GDP. Now, but this is not even it. This is just household debt. Now let's look at national debt. What the PAP has done is that they have created debt for Singaporeans and make Singaporeans pay for the debt that they have created. If you remember, the PAP borrows from our CPF to invest in the investment firms Temasek Holdings and GIC. Now, as of today, the PAP has borrowed 404 billion from Singaporeans. This debt is owned by Singaporeans. So let's look at an illustration. Say if someone wants to borrow money from you, they'll give you a collateral, right? Or a form of security so that they know that you will not run away with their money. Now, what if the PAP borrows from your CPF? Did the PAP give you any collateral for your CPF? And if the PAP has not given you any collateral, can the PAP run away with your money? So what is happening is that the PAP forces Singaporeans to give them our CPF. The PAP then forces us to lend them our CPF for their investment. And because you need a collateral, right? Now, who else to be a better collateral than Singaporeans? In order for the PAP to be able to accumulate CPF, they need someone to work. And so Singaporeans have to be kept in labour so that we are able to keep producing CPF for the PAP to invest. So who says there's no collateral? There is a collateral. Your labour and your work is considered the collateral to the PAP, and Singaporeans have to keep working so that the PAP can have a continuous stream of money from the CPF that they can take to invest. Now let's look at it from another illustration. Now if the government borrows money from another country, the government will then owe another country money. And because the government has to pay off this debt, Singaporeans would have to be the ones to pay off this debt by paying higher taxes and receiving lesser subsidies. But in Singapore's case, the PAP does not borrow money from other countries. The PAP borrows money from Singaporeans. And then the PAP owns Singaporeans' money. So the PAP has to pay off this debt back to Singaporeans, right? And who pays? Singaporeans. The PAP has created debt for us by borrowing money from our CPF, and then the PAP makes us pay off this debt. So essentially what is happening is that we are double paying. Not only are we double paying on essential services, we are double paying on debts as well. So here's how it works. The PAP borrows money from Singaporeans. So by right, the PAP should be the one to pay the money back to Singaporeans. But instead, the PAP has made Singaporeans pay the debt back to them. And so we are forced to double pay on the debt. So what has happened is that because the PAP pays us such low wages, Singaporeans are forced into a household debt of 77.2% of GDP. The PAP borrows from our CPF and creates a national debt of 115% of GDP. And because we have to pay off this debt as well, we have to pay off another 115% of GDP. So what this means is that Singaporeans are actually in a debt of more than 300% of GDP. Now there's a debt of more than 300% of GDP, but the PAP is only willing to spend 2% of GDP in social spending. What this means is that the PAP is only willing to pay less than 1% of the debt that they have created for Singaporeans. Now in monetary terms, last year our GDP was $370 billion. So our debt by today will be more than $1 trillion in Singapore. So what this means is that each Singaporean actually go into a debt of $360,000. Now if we have to pay off this debt by using our full wage, we would need to spend 10 years to pay this debt off. If we only take half our wage to pay off this debt, we have to spend 20 years to pay off this debt that the PAP has created for Singaporeans. Now so much so that Singaporeans want to retire at 65 but we cannot, because we have to work another 20 years to pay off this debt. And we have to work until we are 85 or until we die. So the third trick in the PAP's book, the triple debt lock-in. The PAP has locked us in with the household debt, with the national debt, and to make us double pay on the national debt to a tune of 300% of GDP. And as I had written before, in 1984, the PAP had wanted to delay the retirement age from 55 to 60. However, there was a strong backlash against this, so the PAP decided to implement a CPF minimum sum at 55 to trap our money in the CPF so that we are not able to take our money out and we are forced to work longer. So the PAP has managed to effectively use the CPF minimum sum to delay our retirements so that they can then extract more of our CPF for their investment. So this is 1984. But do you know that from 1994, the PAP spiked up the CPF minimum sum? From 1996 onwards, the CPF minimum sum grew by 8% every year. However, inflation only grew by 1% every year. So why did the PAP create the CPF minimum sum in 1984 to cut down on Singaporeans? And why is it after 1994 the PAP decided to spike up the CPF minimum sum and thus lock in more of Singaporeans' CPF such that we are not able to take it out, we are not able to save and retire? But for the PAP, the CPF minimum sum is not enough. There's now talk that they now want to increase the retirement age to 67. And why do they need Singaporeans to keep working and working? As mentioned, our labour is the only collateral that the PAP has on the CPF. In order for them to have more and more CPF to invest, they need us to keep working so that they can keep extracting our CPF. And so, the last trick in the book, the CPF debt labour bondage. Because the PAP borrows from our CPF to finance their debt, and because we have to keep working to finance their CPF, we are locked into a CPF debt labour bondage. So here you go, the full magic PAP plan to stab Singaporeans in the back. The wage CPF HDB trinity, the double payment trickery, the triple debt lock-in, and the CPF debt labour bondage. Now this is the grand magic PAP plan to stab Singaporeans in the back. Now this is all not accidental. If you realize today that you are not able to save and retire, it is not accidental. The PAP created this. If you realize today that you're not able to afford healthcare, it is not accidental. The PAP created this. They paid you low wages. Now in this video, you have seen how the PAP has used CPF, HDB and debt to entrap Singaporeans. In the next part of the video, I will show you when the PAP entrapment plan all began, and when the PAP began to cut down on Singaporeans. On the 3rd of May, we will be holding an event to advocate for the rights of Singaporeans for fair wages and rightful employment. Now Singaporeans, it is time that we stand up and we fight for ourselves. Now the PAP is unwilling to give Singaporeans fair wages, and the PAP is unwilling to enact laws to protect the employment of Singaporeans. We cannot take this sitting down. We need to speak up and we need to have a voice. If we are able to stand united, we will create a Singapore that we can be proud of. On 3rd of May, join us. Let's come together and create a society that will benefit all Singaporeans and protect all Singaporeans, and a Singapore that we can all be proud of.